Hello, my name is Brian Baca. I'm the Product Support Manager for Infosol, and in today's session we'll be discussing the newly released InfoBurst Build 124. In this presentation we'll be discussing some of the key features of this build. However, a full accounting of all changes and fixes contained in Build 124 can be found in the InfoBurst Support Wiki, which is located at wiki.infosol.com/InfoBurst, and we'll show you a link to that just a bit later. So we'll discuss various changes made or enhancements made in Build 124, and the first changes involve document processing. Generally, document processing means processing reports, BusinessObjects reports, Microsoft reports, and any changes that may have occurred around this category of functionality. The first enhancement introduces support for SAP BI 4.0. We now support Service Pack 8 for 4.0, and also support was introduced for BI 4.1 SP2. Now, in the past, when a new service pack of BusinessObjects was released, InfoBurst would require some development to accommodate for any changes in these new service packs, then introduce those in a new build. However, in BI 4.1, we found that there is some consistency from service pack to service pack in terms of the API that InfoBurst uses to interface with BusinessObjects. Therefore, we believe that in the future we'll be able to support new service packs of BI 4.1 that won't require an update in InfoBurst. So BI 4.1, the Service Pack 3 was just released last week, and we anticipate validating this service pack in the coming days and then notifying you via email notification that Build 124 will support this new service pack. So we'll certainly let you know when this validation has occurred, and we do anticipate being able to support this in future service packs without necessarily updating your InfoBurst build. The next enhancement regards extra columns, what's known as the extra column macro. And for those that aren't familiar with this feature, users will typically invoke what we call the extra column macro to name their files and folders. So just as an example, the table that we see on the bottom left of the screen there contains a column for state. In a typical scenario, we would be bursting report, in this case by state, and we would pull our state values for that prompt from this data source. Users will then go on to use other columns of information from the data source for things like email delivery. So we have a column labeled email, and we would pull our email addresses from that column. Or the column labeled division. We might use that division value to name the resulting files. So we call these extra columns. In 124, we now support the use of a data source containing extra columns at what's called the parameter source level. Let's look in InfoBurst and talk about how this is used. So let's just build a simple burst. We'll use this performance by state report and call this extra column. So we've added the report to a burst, and first off we will apply our data source to the prompt, enter values for state. And we'll utilize we have a multi-column list called states list. We'll apply that to the parameter. We'll just take a peek at that. So again, we have our state values that we'll use for the prompt, and then we'll go on to use other values or other columns from this data source. We'll apply that. Now, before we go on to the delivery where we'll invoke the extra column, let's first talk about how things worked before Build 124. So before Build 124, it was possible to leverage extra columns from a data source, but to do it, the data source had to be applied at what we call the document source level. And document source's the intent for this feature is to allow you to control reports with multiple prompts using a single source. So if this report, for example, had 20 prompts and we had a data source that contained values for all those prompts, would apply that data source here and then control that document globally. However, we can also use document source, or could use it, if we needed access to extra columns for example, file naming. The change made in 124 allows us to apply the data source here at the parameter source level, where we can now access those extra columns. It just makes it easier to create the burst and access these extra columns of information without having to go through the step of creating and applying this document source. So we've applied our data source here. Now we'll move on to the delivery, where we'll invoke the extra column. So we'll send this out to this report out to a network share, and we'll name the report using, among other things, the extra column information. So let's create a file name including our state value. So we are bursting for state. So state report 4, and then we'll invoke that column called division. So this is an extra column macro, bracket, percent, and then the name of the column, division, close bracket, and then the word division. So we'll have, California report for HR division, or something to that effect. So this is where we're invoking that extra column to name the file. And then I'll just add a system macro with the name of the burst to create a folder in this network share location. Okay, let's look at the result of this burst. We've run it ahead of time. And the result of this burst was delivered to this folder. Here we got our extra column subfolder created, and within that we have our custom name PDF file. So we burst for 4 states, and here's where we've included the that division, that extra column value. So retail, accounting, shipping, and HR, those values came from the data source that gave us our bursting values. The next change involves use of the BusinessObjects CUID, or Cluster Unique ID. When a report or document is cataloged in InfoBurst, we capture various bits of information about that report, including its name, its location, and the BusinessObjects document ID. Now, a few of our users, the way they manage business objects is such that when they move documents between, let's say, development and production, those 2 bits of information can change, right? So the report name may change and the document ID may change. However, the CUID remains consistent. This can have an impact on InfoBurst when we go through platform migration exercises. So in previous builds, we've introduced support for CUID, although you may not have known it. But CUID is captured as part of the document properties, which you see here in the screenshot. Now in build 124, we display the CUID in the document properties, as highlighted here. And then when we do things like platform updates to capture changes to document locations and this sort of thing, or platform migrations where we point from, say, development to production, we can optionally look at the CUID as that consistent piece of information relevant to the change. So this particular change is detailed within the InfoBurst support wiki if you'd like more details, but we do now support the use of CUID. The next change regards publishing and specifically content grouping. So for those users that don't leverage content grouping today, content grouping allows you to take the output for one or more reports in a burst and group them together into a single PDF or Excel file. And in prior builds, you could take that group content and deliver it to specific locations like network folders or FTP sites. In build 124, we've expanded content grouping to support what are called delivery templates. A delivery template is used to predefine a delivery, both the format and destination, and then that template can be reused in a burst. You can now use the delivery template at the content grouping level. So now it is possible to deliver grouped content to any destination supported by InfoBurst, including destinations like SharePoint. You can send to the BusinessObjects portal, or as we'll look at in a moment, we can do things like intelligent email delivery of bursted grouped content. So let's look at an example of some of the changes to content grouping. So, excuse me, moving forward with build 124 and later builds, to use content grouping in a burst, the prerequisite will be the creation of the delivery template. Again, the template defines the destination, where you're going to send that file, and also the format. So what we'll do here is create a new delivery template. We'll just call this email PDF, where we will define the destination. We'll say email. Now for this delivery, we will do an intelligent email delivery, which means we're going to burst the report. In our example, we'll use actually the same data source. We're going to burst by state, and then we're going to pull the extra column with the email addresses for delivery. So I'll just define the extra column email here in my delivery. And we want PDF, that's the default, so that's all we'll do here. So we have our template defining the delivery. Now we'll build the burst. In this example, we'll group two different reports together. We'll take these two Webby reports. We'll call this burst content grouping. Now in this example, we're going to burst both reports. They're both state reports. We're going to burst them for the same values, group together the common state reports into a single file. So both reports burst for state California, take those two PDFs, group them together, and then send that grouped California PDF off to the California recipient. So that's our use case. So we'll start with the bursting of these reports. So each report has a prompt for state, which I will drive with a data source that contains our state values. We'll use the same list we used in our previous example, our states list. Then we'll apply that same list to the state revenue report. So that's the bursting. We now move on to the content grouping. We drill into the burst properties. Our format is PDF. We will group by document variable. If you group by burst, that just means collect any and all files, PDFs produced from the burst, mash them together. In this case, we'll group by the bursting variable, state. We need to apply our template, email PDF. We also need to define the grouping variable. In this case, that variable is the prompt, enter values for state. So we save that, and if we look at the result of this burst, this was sent out to email. So in the burst, we burst by two reports by state. In the data source, for state California, my email address was defined as the recipient for the California grouped content. So I received the following attachment, and within this PDF we have grouped together content from both reports, but only for California data. So the content of the first state report burst for California, and then the second state report also burst for state California. And as I said, we can deliver this group content now to destinations like SharePoint and like BI4 Launchpad. So any destination that's currently supported by a delivery. The next enhancement is in the area of deliveries. We can now deliver the native format of BusinessObjects reports to a SharePoint destination, specifically a SharePoint document library. For Web Intelligence, that's the WID or WID format, the RPT format for Crystal reports, and the REP for Desktop Intelligence reports. The next change regards the XDC and specifically BI4 Web Intelligence reports used in XDC. In Build 124, when we add a BI4 Web Intelligence report to the XDC, by default, we will no longer display what we call the report parts, which are the pictures or images of the different tables of data in the Webby report. Instead, by default, we'll display a list of the part names. Now, this was done for a few reasons, most specifically performance and data volume. So, in BI4, with some of the improvements that were made to what's called the Web Service SDK, BI4 is now able to produce much larger data sets from Web Intelligence for use in the cache. We have some users who are producing 100, 200, 300,000 rows of data from a Webby report to populate a cache. And now the problem with report parts when building XDCs is that the process of obtaining that part when the data set is very large can sometimes take up to minutes to resolve. So to resolve that problem, we've now defaulted to the part name for selecting the part from the report. Now, if you prefer to see report parts, you can enable use of that picture, that image of the report part in the user interface. So if you open the report properties, we have a report here. And again, this is only for BI4 Web Intelligence reports. You can optionally enable use of the part. Just be aware that if the data set is large, the rendering of the part can take a bit of time. Now, one best practice when using BI4 Webby reports is to uniquely name the report parts. By default, I think Web Intelligence would label them something like Table 1 and Table 2. But it's very easy to go into Web Intelligence and provide unique names for those parts to make selection of those parts easier in the XDC. So here in the Web Intelligence Designer, if you go into Design Mode and then select what's called the Document Structure view, which is this icon here, you'll see a listing of the different parts of the report. And you can see your table or tables displayed. So here we have our vertical table. And if you right-click that table and select Format Table, you then have the option to provide a custom name. So here, instead of the default Table 1, I've labeled it State Data. Then, when we add that report to the XDC, we'll see that label in the drop list. The next changes regard the platform, kind of overall changes to the system, and the first is what we call the macro builder. The macro builder is an easy-to-use drag-and-drop interface for selecting and using what we call InfoBurst system macros. Macros are just placeholders where we can insert different bits of information for folder and file naming and even to drive things like report parameters. And I think most of you are familiar with macros in this system. They're very popular. But to use macros in the past, you had to know what which macros performed which functions. You had to know what their syntax was for usage. There's a reference document for this in the wiki, but because the library of macros is so large, it could get difficult to remember and manage these macros. So we've introduced the macro builder. So the macro builder gives you a user interface into those macros where we can see all of the various macros available in the system by category. We can select macros and see what their purpose is, how they're used, and even syntax for their usage. And then we can actually go on to build our macro strings using this macro builder. So let's look at an example of that. We'll take our performance by state report again and add it to a burst. Now I'm going to go ahead and assign a data source to our prompt for state. Let's drop that here and drag it to our state prompt. That will come into play with our macro builder example, and we'll call this burst macro builder. So the most common place this will be used would be in deliveries for reports. So we'll add a new delivery for the Webby report. And in the previous examples, you've seen me type in the macros manually. Now we'll invoke the macro builder to build those same file names. So we'll select our destination, which is our share folder. And then here in the file name field, instead of typing the macros, we'll invoke the macro builder. Now, anywhere in the user interface that you see this M icon, that means that this field supports use of the macro builder, and the appropriate macros for that field will be displayed. So if we open the macro builder, we have access to all of the system macros broken out by category. So the first category is data macros. So here we're using a data source, which contains columns for the different information you see here. Now, to use the macro, we can drag and drop it, or simply double click it, and it will add it to this blank field on the right where we're building our macro or our file name. So I'm using the state macro, and we'll build the same file name we built in the last example. So we'll say state report, we'll type in some static text here, report for, and let's invoke that division extra column macro again. So let's give us this division value. So we select it and then just double click it to add it to the string. So state report for, let's say HR division be one of the values. We'll put in the word division here. And then let's also include a date stamp in the file name. So again, the macros are all arranged by category, so you can browse through the macro, select different macros for their definitions, usage examples. Here we'll select the today macro. So I'll add that to the file name. Now I'll go ahead and enter the format manually because I know what format I want. But the different format options are described here in the macro description. So I'll just say today mm-dd/year. So we can build the macro or the file name here, and we can also resolve it, preview that file name to make sure we've gotten all the pieces correct so we can see that displayed. Now, some of the values will not be available. They're only available at runtime, so we'll just include a placeholder here. So that looks good. If I select apply, that will now enter that string I've built into the file name. And again, you can use the macro builder in various locations. So here, for example, I might want to create a subfolder with the name of our burst. So I could invoke the burst name macro here as a subfolder. So you'll see this M macro next to any field that supports use of the new macro builder. The next change is to email actions. An action is something that can be applied to the status of a burst, XDC, or schedule containing one of those objects, where the action would perform some task like running an external program or creating a trigger file, or in this example, sending an email notification. There's an example of it there on the left, and we would use the email action for things like notification of burst status. So I want to let a user know or be informed when, let's say, a burst aborts. We could use the email action for that. Now, in the past, the email action would just send you what you see there, which is a subject line and a message. But it would not include what we call the activity log, which is the runtime log for the burst or XDC. This is something that you could receive, but really only as an administrator. So within the email action, we've now given you the option to include activity log, which will amend to this email alert an attachment of the email, the activity log in Excel format, and also render the activity log inline in the message. So this opens up receipt of this job notification with logging to all users in the system. On the right, we can see here where we've applied our email action to the abort status of the burst. Now, the alert you receive would look something like this. So the message would include a description of the burst that failed and all the relevant details, the attached activity logs as Excel, and then the activity log is rendered inline in the message, so you can browse through all the details or just jump to the aborted step. There are a few new date macros in the system, and again, with the new macro builder, you'd see these listed under the date category of macros. They are the first day in month and first day in next month macros, and here's just an example. So give me the date for the first Tuesday in every month, and it would automatically resolve that date. The user's report is an administrator's report that will detail for a particular user or all users in the system details about those users and objects that they own. So this might be useful for audit purposes or when migrating objects from one user to another. Within the user interface, under the Users panel, again accessible to administrators, we could, with this first icon here, create a report for all users, or selecting a specific user, create the usage report here at a user level. So if I select this, InfoBurst will produce a PDF report which we can then save to our local machine. And then within that report we can see various details about that user. So this is just an example of this report where it contains user profile information and then goes on to catalog all objects by location owned by that user. Document name synchronization. There are select users who as part of their business objects process, regularly change the names of their business objects reports. So it's maybe as an example of versioning reports named report V1, and after changes, that report name is updated to report V2. This can have impacts in InfoBurst, but in this specific use case, the user was looking to keep in sync the name of the report in BusinessObjects with the name of the report object in InfoBurst. So when we catalog a report, we capture that initial report name, but then by default the user is free to go and change that object name to whatever is meaningful to them. With this option, we can now lock down the file naming and keep it in sync with the same reports in BusinessObjects. So should that report name change in BusinessObjects, the user would recatalog the report, and with this option enabled, InfoBurst would capture that change and update the object name appropriately. The setting can be invoked at a system level at the platform. So the platform represents the connection to the BusinessObjects server, and any document from that environment would be synced with the platform with this option enabled. Or we can enable this option down at an individual document level. If we drill into the document properties, we can enable it for just specific documents. But remember, if you turn this feature on, you then no longer have the ability to customize object names within InfoBurst. Everything is synchronized with the platform. Server licensing, just a minor change in build 124. In previous builds, our license model referenced both the InfoBurst server's name and what's called the MAC address, the network interface card address. Should any of these two pieces of information change, the license would be invalidated and you'd have to get a new license. Now, select sites had environmental issues where the operating system had issues reading this network interface card, this address, and that would cause issues with the license. So we've eased the restriction a bit, where in build 124 and any new licenses we issue, we will then now only reference the server's name and no longer reference the MAC address. So if you fall into this category of sites where you've had these environmental issues, chances are we've already issued you a new license, but should you encounter this issue or just require or desire one of these new licenses, just reach out to us via support and we can issue you a key. For the most part, most users will not be affected by this change. You don't need to do anything. It really only impacts you if you have one of these environments where we have trouble reading this MAC address. So build 124 is available for general release, and it's available on the InfoSol support site at support.infosol.com. The release notes are available in the InfoBurst support wiki, and that's available at wiki.infosol.com/InfoBurst. And as always, don't forget to back up your InfoBurst environment prior to running an update. Backup instructions are also available in the InfoBurst Support Wiki under Administration.